Welcome to the next episode of the Institutions for Conflict Resolution vlog series. In this series, we discuss research on the topics of access to justice, alternative and digital dispute resolution, and judicial decision-making. In this episode, we welcome Dr. Carolyn McKay, who is a senior research fellow at Sydney University Institute of Criminology. Dr. McKay has done a lot of research on the issues of the use of remote technologies, digital technologies in criminal justice. And she is also the author of a widely acclaimed book, The Pixelated Prisoner, which we will talk about in a minute. But before we get into discussing the book, I will start from the very beginning. And I would like to ask you why and how did you get interested in this topic of digitalization in criminal justice?
Thanks very much, Anna. That's actually a really interesting question, and I don't know if you know the answer, but I actually came to this topic through my visual arts practice. So I have dual qualifications in law and criminology, but also in visual arts. So I had actually done a master's by research in visual art. And in that particular project, it was called By Word of Mouth. Mm-hmm. And I was looking at the experience of witnesses when they're giving their evidence in court in person. I was focusing particularly on eyewitness testimony in murder trials. And so I was going to murder trials in Australia and listening to eyewitnesses talking about these situations. Then I was using some of that text from that eyewitness testimony to inspire some of my visual artworks. And my visual artworks at that point in time were very much audio and visual technologies. I was creating art installations using video technologies and audio technologies. Anyway, so I did all that. And at the end of that degree, we had the graduating exhibition. And one of my law friends came along and saw the exhibition and said, "Carolyn, you know, lawyers would be really interested in this." And that got me thinking, because I knew I wanted to go on to do a PhD. And I had always thought I'd just do my PhD at art school. But then I suddenly thought, I wonder if lawyers would be interested in what I'm doing. So I took my PhD proposal to Sydney Law School, expecting that they'd go, that's rubbish. But they actually didn't. They loved it. And so I ended up doing my PhD back in law. So my first degree was in law. I had arts qualifications in between, and then I ended up going back to law. But it was through that arts project that I became increasingly aware that people weren't actually appearing in a physical court anymore, that there were a lot more people who were appearing on screens, which I was surprised about at the time. This is quite a while ago. And so that sort of led me to start to look at what is the experience of those people who are giving their evidence or appearing for other matters from some remote place. They're not actually physically in the courtroom. And at the same time, I actually went to a court as I was developing my proposal. I went to court and watched people appear for parole. So in our system, you serve your sentence and then you can be potentially released a little bit early, subject to parole and supervision. And I went along and watched these people on screen, and they were just sitting motionless, and they were dressed in prison uniform. And I was really intrigued as to what their experience was. What was it like to be appearing, seeking release, seeking freedom from a detention centre? What would it be like to have that matter heard when you're actually not in the room? Everyone else is in the courtroom talking about you, but you are the only person who's not there. And I was really interested to know what that experience was. So that's what kind of led me to that particular research.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Also, particularly that you have started research in this area quite some time ago and before COVID pandemic was in place. And obviously the fact that we've had COVID and now we are using remote technologies in criminal procedures on a much larger scale, it makes your research even more relevant than ever. And what if you were to formulate, like in one sentence or two sentences, what is it that you're trying to achieve? What is your goal? What is your purpose of doing research, of engaging in this area?
Oh, in one sentence, that's cruel. I don't think I can say it in one sentence. But I think I'm interested.
2 sentences.
Okay, 2 sentences. Okay, I might just use lots of ands, make it one really long sentence. I think I'm very interested. I accept that digitalization and technologies have to come into criminal justice, and I accept that. At the same time, I think there are some unintended consequences of the technologies that can lead to some inequalities, to some injustice, and I'm interested in that focus.
Yeah, so the particular focus on lived experiences of individuals with the criminal justice through the lens of social inequality. I think that is really something that is extremely interesting. Also, something that is at the very cutting edge of the current research in the field and the field of criminal justice in particular. So talking about the social inequality and all these big theoretical concepts, I wanted to ask a few questions about the theoretical orientation or theoretical approach that you have used in your work. So you use concepts such as digital criminology, critical criminology, Foucauldian discourse, etc. So could you maybe expand on what do you mean by digital criminology?
Oh, sure. So with my more recent research, which is after the pixelated prisoner, I'm starting to look at my research through this concept of digital criminology. Now, digital criminology is something that can be understood in a few different ways. So it can be just seen as a topic to be studied and for research. It can be seen as a subject that I actually teach. So I have a unit of study, a postgraduate unit of study that is about the use of technologies throughout the whole criminal justice system. But it can also be just used as a theory. So digital criminology has developed through critical criminology, as you mentioned. And I think it's become a way for us to understand, to look at the core to look at the fundamentals of criminology, such as social inequality, such as power structures. And it adds in that element of how do technologies impact those sorts of relationships? So how does the introduction of new technologies throughout criminal justice system, not just audiovisual links, but thinking about all the technologies that are going into prisons, use of AI, robots in prisons, the use of predictive policing in criminal justice, all of those sorts of technologies, what is great about them, but also what is perhaps challenging and what is perhaps causing some social harms that perhaps people don't look at. So digital criminology is a way of looking at these sorts of structures. It's very much looking at how technology is embedded in our society. It is so embedded, we don't even notice it really anymore. Most of us have at least multiple technologies available, although with my research I find that there's still a lot of a digital divide, that there's still a lot of people in the world who don't have access to basic internet and basic digital devices. But in more affluent parts of society, it's invisible. It is just there. It's pervasive all the time. So we now live in this sort of digital society where we are now digital subjects, and I'm sort of really interested in looking at that. It's digital criminology builds on and goes beyond something like cybercriminology. I'm not sure if that's something that you've looked at as well, but cybercriminology was perhaps the first iteration of this theory, but it tends to be stuck in a space where it's only looking really at criminal behavior in cyberspace and, more computer-enabled type.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So indeed, digital criminology adds this layer of sort of examining the dynamics of power, social dynamics of power, and the politics behind it. And as I've mentioned before, you also rely on Foucault, a famous French philosopher who has actually influenced a great area of different disciplines.
Yes.
And what you say is that a key point in Foucault's analysis is that these technologies of power should appear banal, small, and subtle, exude neutrality, and go unnoticed. The functioning of power is thus invisible and internalized in subjects who passively self-regulate. So could you expand on this, and how does this idea actually relate to your research findings?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So I was very much, when I was looking at Foucault, that was very much for the book, The Pixelated Prisoner. I've sort of moved on a bit from Foucault now, but I think Foucault's work was particularly relevant in that context of talking to people in prison about their use of these technologies to connect with the outside world. So I think I conceptualized audio-visual link technologies or video conferencing technologies as being a prison technology, and part of that whole carceral context whereby people in prison would become aware that there were various video and audio-visual technologies throughout a prison, various forms of surveillance obviously throughout a prison, and that sort of very much works in a number of ways. So first of all, you can conceptualize these technologies as being like a part of the panopticon, that notion that they are subject to constant surveillance, but they never know when. And that surveillance is one way. They actually do not have reciprocity to be able to see who is seeing them. So that's a major form of power over people. Right. And once you're aware of that, you internalize that notion, or you may internalize that notion and be aware that you are constantly subject to being surveilled. Right. And therefore you become docile. You become a docile body, which of course in prisons they like people to be docile. They don't like people to be reactive or pushing back on things. So I was looking at it from that point of view. But I was also applying Foucault to look at the audiovisual link technologies as creating a new demarcation in criminal justice. So I was looking at how these technologies create spatial demarcations, visual demarcations, those sorts of physical demarcations, because when we're using these technologies, the people in prison are the only people who are not in court. This is before the pandemic. Things obviously changed during the pandemic and lots of people weren't in courts. But before the pandemic, often the only person who wasn't in court was a person who was the subject of the whole matter. And they were actually physically, spatially, visually excluded from the courtroom. So I use Foucault in that for that means as well. Yeah.
Well, we'll come to the discussion of the lived experiences of the prisoners in a minute, because I think this is really what is so fascinating about your research. But let me ask the last question on the theory, because when we talk about Foucault, I think something that comes to mind immediately is another name, which is Pierre Bourdieu, who was a close colleague of Foucault and who has developed this theory of habitus and field, which also helps to explain how power structures are being sustained over time. And he actually argued that it's through the practices or habitual practices, non-reflective practices of actors in the criminal justice systems, that this power structures or the existing inequalities are being sustained and perpetuated. And he has also developed a theory of disruption. So then when there is the change in the field and the environment in which these actors actually work, then they can change their ways, and then innovation or more democratization can occur. We all know that Richard Susskind, for instance, he is a big proponent of this idea of disruption in technology in relation to legal services. And all this, of course, is quite theoretical, but based on the insights from your own research, do you have examples, or what do you see as happening rather? Is this rather a perpetuation of the habitual practices, or do you see also instances of disruption where, the whole process can become more democratized?
That's a great question. I guess I see it, I think the pandemic was a disrupting factor. As for technologies, I see them, rather than being disruptive, I think they're transformative. I think that I very much go back to that notion of the quote that you read out about Foucault, talking about technologies, how they should be, to be effective, they need to be unseen and invisible. And, we think that they're benign or banal, but they're actually not. So I think we need to recognize that technologies aren't necessarily banal or benign, that they are actually transformative. And that's not to say that they're all negative. I think that there's some very positive transformations that occur with technologies. And certainly, especially since March 2020, when the World Health Organization told us that there was this worldwide pandemic going on, what we saw is that, of course, courts all across the world had to close down, at least temporarily, to try and maintain, public health, public safety in that situation. And certainly prisons all around the world went into lockdown so that people actually couldn't be moved from their prisons to come to court. So there was a major crisis facing the justice system, both civil and criminal justice. So we needed to be able to move on. Otherwise, it would have been terrible if we couldn't find a way for court matters to continue. Otherwise, people could be, especially in the criminal justice system, people could be caught up in prison for well beyond the time that they would have ever been sentenced to. So it was very important for the courts to find a way to get through this. So the technologies were very much adopted as a strategy to try and keep courts moving through that period of time. But it was transformative of how we do law. I mean, typically criminal justice has been done in a way where we are together, we're in a shared space. It's a place where you are subject to the authority of the court. It's a place of gravitas, solemnity. It's a place where we hopefully have truth-telling. That's questionable. But it's a place where we make meaning as a society. It's where we resolve civil conflict, where there's a civil matter. We try and resolve problems between private parties. In the criminal justice system, we come there for the state to be prosecuting people and working out if they're guilty or not guilty. So that is something for hundreds of years that we have typically done together in a physical space. But yes, obviously during the pandemic that couldn't happen. So I think, the pandemic was a disruption. I think the use of the technologies was more transformative because we ended up moving from this face-to-face, in-person, physical inaction performance of criminal justice, and it very much suddenly turned into this online virtual realm.
So I think this idea very much fits into one of the conclusions in your book, where you say that we cannot say whether the use of digital technology in criminal justice for defendants and other participants in the criminal justice process is good or bad. It is just different. And we don't know yet how this is different, and this is why more research is needed in this field. Your research also resonates very much with the topic of access to justice, which is one of our core topics in our research program. But I think we can't really talk about access to justice without discussing the experiences of the people who are actually the subject of that access to justice. And your research is really one of the very few in the area of criminal justice that really taps into the experiences of the individuals with the system, which, of course, I mean, it's not surprising that there's no more research because of all sorts of methodological challenges that you have with accessing the population. Now, could you talk more about how did you manage? How did you actually succeed in getting access and tapping into those experiences? And what were some of the challenges that you faced in this process?
Thank you. Yes, it is. Doing research in prison is particularly difficult. So I was quite lucky in some respects that when I put forward this proposal to the university, they thought that yes, I could do that, but I actually had to go through 2 initial ethics committees approval processes. So the first ethics approval I had to go through was with corrective services in my state in Australia, and they were actually incredibly supportive at the time of my research. So they were fairly easy to get approval for doing the research. It was actually more difficult with my own university to get approval. I think they were very concerned about me going into a prison by myself. Well, I mean, not like I was completely by myself, but I think they were concerned about my personal security and safety while I was in a prison. So I had to sort of very much come up with a whole lot of safety and security protocols, how that would work for me. So for instance, in my ethics application to the university, I had to provide details as to that I would have a duress alarm attached to my trousers and all those sorts of things. And it was actually strange when I was actually doing the research. There were a couple of instances where I think my safety was actually compromised, but fortunately nothing happened. But I think some of the prison officers forgot about me and locked me in places with people in prison where they shouldn't have. I think they forgot that this woman who wasn't dressed in a prison uniform actually was there. I think they'd just totally forgotten that I was there. Unfortunately, someone came and found me, but I mean, I didn't ever feel threatened by anybody there, so that was good. So what I had to do is get that ethics approval, and that took at least 6 months to get that process underway. I then had to work very closely with someone from correctional facilities who was in charge of the audio-visual link program in the New South Wales prison system, and he was fantastic. He said, look, we should go to this prison and we should go to that prison. And he very much took me under his wing and he facilitated my visits to the place. But it was always incredibly challenging. So obviously, every time I went to a prison, there were a couple of times where I would arrive, but then I couldn't go in because there'd been a security breach in the prison and they'd gone into a sudden lockdown, so no one was allowed into the place. So there were quite a few times where I'd turn up and had to just go home again because they wouldn't let me in. My very first day of doing research was actually in a women's prison. And this was a great lesson for me as a researcher because I really didn't quite know how to recruit people in prison to entice them to talk to me. I had actually been prohibited from offering enticements, inducements, which I think was a great shame. I think it would have been much easier if I could even have said, look, here's some fresh fruit, something really simple like that, or here's a pen and paper. Again, something really simple. But they wouldn't let me do that, which was a great shame. So I had nothing to offer people. So on the very first day anyway, I turned up to this women's prison and the prison officer sort of said, well, so what are you doing? And I said, look, I want to talk to people about video links. And he said, oh, okay, you sit over there and I'll tell people to come and talk to you. Well, anyway, I sat there and sat there and sat there.
Okay.
And nobody came. All these women were going in, using the video links and coming out and walking straight past me. And eventually I went up to the prison officer and I said, look, no one's come to talk to me. And he said, oh, yeah, well, I'm just saying, oh, do you want to go and talk to that lady over there? And they go, no. And you go, oh, well, that's not really helpful. Anyway, eventually I saw one woman came out of a video links studio. She'd obviously just appeared in court. And I actually just stood up and went over. You know, we caught eye contact. And I just went and said, oh, hi, I'm Carolyn. I'm from the University of Sydney. Just want to talk to you about your video link experience. And she was great. So on my very first day, I had one interview, but it was a very, very good interview. I should also say that Corrective Services had said I should do all my interviews using video conferencing. And I said, no, I really want to actually be in that space. I want to be immersed in a prison. I want to hear the sounds of a prison. I want to see what these spaces are actually like. Yeah. So I insisted that I had to go to prison and be there rather than doing it by video link. And I'm so glad I did, because it really gave me some insights into what that space is like, what it sounds like. It does not sound or feel like a court at all.
Yes. And you actually describe it very vividly by calling it the soundtrack of incarceration, which is a constant, loud sound that is somewhere in the background while you're trying to participate in a court proceeding, which is supposedly, is what is at stake is perhaps 5 or 10 years of your life and being imprisoned. So you've used this very interesting, this very interesting framework of analyzing what you have seen and what you have experienced in the prison by looking at a spatial demarcation, corporeal demarcation, and a visual demarcation. Could you maybe explain what you mean by those terms? I mean, those terms are used in criminology, of course, but I think for law scholars, for instance, this is something that is quite new and unfamiliar.
Thank you. Yes, my research straddles both criminal procedure and criminology. So at Sydney Law School, there's quite a few of us who straddle both the law and the criminology. And then we have other people who are purely lawyers and other people who are purely criminologists. Yes, and there's just a few people like me that are a bit strange and do both. So, I basically found that by going to the prisons and seeing these spaces, I sort of developed this notion that people in prison, if they're appearing in a remote courtroom from prison, they're obviously in a completely different space. So there's the space of the courtroom and then the space of the prison. And the technology obviously connects that space. It brings the two spaces together. And interestingly, from a legislative point of view, the legislation in my jurisdiction says that courtroom space is wherever that remote person is. So the prison is deemed to be part of the courtroom space, even though it's under the authority of the prison authorities rather than the court authorities. So it's sort of this interesting spatial relationship that is brought about through the use of technologies. Right. So, I look at that spatial demarcation that basically, as I mentioned earlier, that in traditional court matters, everyone would come into one space and all be together to make meaning, to resolve whatever the issue is. But now we have a situation where people can be in lots of different spaces and then still connected together. Yeah. But I think before the pandemic, it was more pronounced. This spatial demarcation was more pronounced because usually it was only the person in prison who wouldn't be in court. Now, since the pandemic, perhaps that has lessened because we've seen matters where the judge is at home, the prosecutor is maybe somewhere else. People
wearing his pajamas.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Wearing pajamas with a cat filter on their face or something like that. So We've seen all sorts of examples during the pandemic. So perhaps that spatial demarcation perhaps has dissipated. I'm not sure.
Right.
So the corporeal demarcation, again, is somewhat related. Again, it is about that notion that traditionally we would always be in physical proximity with each other. And for defendants, for people who are on trial, there's a lot of benefits for being in the courtroom, because if you've got legal representation, you can actually have a quiet whisper with them. You can actually, change your instructions or give further information or get some information or some advice from your legal representative right there, very easily. You've also potentially got your family coming into the courtroom to have that sort of physical proximity with your family. So that's sort of that notion of that corporeality. But I think it's, something that's particularly important to people if they've got legal representation, to have that physical proximity. But of course, there was also there's many physical benefits of not coming to court, which I talk about in my book, that for people who come to prison, they're often woken up maybe at 4:30 in the morning, and then transported for hours in really, really dirty prison trucks. They're terrible in Australia. I don't know if they're better here, but they're really apparently disgusting, not well cleaned, and there's no toilet facilities. People are always strip searched before they get onto a truck, strip searched when they get off, and probably strip searched as they have to go back as well. So maybe up to 4 strip searches in one day. There's a lot of physical, terrible hardships involved in coming to court. So these technologies are good at minimising that.
Right.
The visual demarcation is in relation to when you appear on a screen. And as I haven't been to the courts here, I don't know what they're like here, but in courts in Australia, there's different configurations, but often the screen is quite large. Yeah. And if you appear from court, you're actually much larger than life size.
Same here.
Like your head's massive.
Yeah.
But you can usually just maybe see your head and your shoulders. You can see that people appear from prison. They're wearing usually their prison outfit. So there's a visual stigmatization of those people immediately. Right. They are demarcated as being someone who is in prison. There's often a sign behind them saying that they're appearing from a prison as well. So that's what I mean by that visual demarcation.
Right. Can you maybe give some examples of how does it feel for the people to appear on the other side of the screen? What are some of the consequences for their own perception of what is going on, of the proceedings?
Yeah, so I had all these interviews with people in prison, and they told me about those experiences. So actually the name of the book, The Pixelated Prisoner, was inspired by one man who said, when I appear in court on the screen, I feel like a bunch of pixels. So he didn't feel like he was actually a human or a fellow citizen being able to present himself as a human. He just felt he had been reduced to pixels on a screen. Women in particular actually were concerned about how they appeared on a screen. It was quite interesting that because in prisons you typically don't have proper mirrors, because glass can be broken and turned either into a weapon or something to harm yourself with. So at least in Australian prison, it's just like polished metal, and you can't really see yourself very well in them. So I've been into the toilets and had a look at myself, and I'm sort of very blurry. So really hard to see, what you're looking like. So women were telling me that they didn't like appearing on the screen because they suddenly saw a little picture-in-picture image of themselves. And they said that was often the first time that they'd seen a proper reflection of themselves since they'd been in prison, and they got quite distressed that they, looked disheveled, that their hair had gone grey. If they'd been dyeing their hair before in the free world and they suddenly looked disheveled, they felt very ashamed of how their appearance had gone, and the fact that they were wearing prison clothes as well. They found that quite distressing. But yeah, a lot of people talked about watching themselves and thinking, this is like watching a TV show, except they mention my name sometimes.
So this disengagement was very present. I think it really fits into one of the findings that are very much emphasized in your book, and which I found fascinating, is that you say that the technology creates the illusion of proximity, but in fact it enlarges distance. So this, the sense of disengagement with what is going on. So this all being said, well, we've already said before, and what you've already also emphasized is that, the use of technology is maybe not disruptive, but it is transformative. So it is, the proceedings, the participation, the modes of participation are changing. What would be your advice? What do you think is urgently needed in terms of research in the coming 2 or 5 years in this area? Where should we put our efforts in?
That's a great question. Oh my goodness, I think there's so many things. So at the moment I'm doing new research. Since the Pixelated Prisoner, I'm doing my own new research and trying to look at what has happened since the pandemic. What is the legacy of the pandemic? We all know how much these technologies have been fantastic in keeping education going, for instance, as well as the courts and so many other services throughout society. So there's been some real benefits. I think in terms of my own jurisdiction, what I'm seeing with my current research is that there is still a huge digital divide. As I mentioned, I think in big cities and in affluent areas, we assume that we can go completely digital, and it's quite simple. Even the hotel I'm staying at here, there's no actual key or card for my room. It's all on my mobile phone. Now that very much presupposes that I have a smartphone that I can use. Now, if I had turned up at that hotel without a smartphone, I don't know how I would get into my room, because we have this presumption that everyone now has a smartphone. I don't think that we all do. I'm sure, I don't know about the European situation, but I know in my country there is still this digital divide, and I think we need to be looking at how can we increase the infrastructure into other regional and remote areas of the world. How can we be increasing access to justice through perhaps justice hubs? I think one of the findings that I'm going to be talking about in my research is, can we be sort of setting up more little satellite justice hubs all around the place, so that these are places that people can go to, whether they're a victim, a complainant, a witness, a defendant, that people can go perhaps to a little justice hub and appear in court or seek legal advice from some little hub where they don't have to travel, for hours or days or whatever, that they can go somewhere more local and have access to digital technology. So I think we need to be looking at research that looks into that. But I think some other areas that I want to look at as well are the impacts on outcomes. So this is something I've started talking with, for example, prosecutors in my jurisdiction. I've queried how the use of these technologies for vulnerable witnesses and victims and complainants, does that diminish the quality of their evidence that they're giving in court? Instead of actually physically being in court, if they appear in a pre-recorded interview or if they appear from a remote space, does that diminish the quality of their evidence? Does that in itself lead to some different outcome? Does it lead to reduced convictions? Well, the prosecutors in my jurisdiction tell me no, they think it's actually increased prosecution, successful prosecution. So I'm interested to try and find out more about that. I think looking at outcomes would be good. I think looking at the optimal configurations for technology would be good. How do we have technologies that can capture all of the micro expressions that we've been sharing, the nonverbal communication? How can we have technologies that capture that in the most optimal way? I think that would be really good. There's some ideas.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So there's still a lot to do and research in this area. And I would like to close the interview at this and to thank you very much for your time, for your valuable ideas. It was fantastic to have this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your interest. It's been great.